he stepped off the train into a world that felt unreal. Sergeant Joseph Weber, a German soldier captured in Tunisia, had spent weeks crossing the Atlantic on a Liberty ship. Each wave had seemed to rock him closer to the fate he feared most: violence, humiliation, perhaps even execution. His mind swirled with the stories his comrades had whispered in the dark, the warnings drilled into him by Nazi propaganda. They had painted America as decadent, weak, and cruel, a nation of chaos and moral decay. Every fiber of his being had expected brutality, yet as he looked around, all he saw was calm. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, not gunpowder or smoke. The distant murmur of laborers in the orchards sounded more like a lullaby than a threat. The camp was unlike anything he had imagined. Barracks lined up neatly with clean mattresses, floors swept and orderly. Guards walked past without shouting or striking, speaking firmly but without malice. 3 times a day food arrived: roast beef, fresh bread, vegetables, even fruit. The first time Joseph lifted the tray to his mouth, he froze, disbelieving. This could not be real. He had imagined starvation, punishment, endless fear. Instead, he ate, and the taste of simple, warm food was almost shocking in its normalcy. For a moment, he wondered if he had died and gone somewhere else, perhaps heaven, but even that idea didn't feel quite right. Other prisoners whispered among themselves, equally astonished. They had expected chains, whips, and screams. They had prepared for the worst and were getting the best. Joseph was assigned to the pear orchards of the Rogue Valley, a lush stretch of land where the soil smelled sweet and the trees hung heavy with fruit. Every morning he would step outside, the sun warming his back, and realize again that this was real. No one mocked him for being a soldier of the enemy. No one treated him as less than human. The local farmers fascinated him most of all. Some spoke German, bridging the strange gap between prisoner and host. One elderly man, soft-spoken and smiling, offered him work and even suggested that after the war, Joseph could return and build a life there. Joseph's mind struggled to comprehend such generosity. How could a country so powerful, capable of crushing enemies, choose instead to feed, protect, and prepare them for the future? This question haunted him, making him both uneasy and curious. Work became a strange kind of therapy. The orchards demanded attention, strength, and care. Joseph learned the rhythm of tending trees, the subtle movements required to harvest fruit without bruising it. He learned patience, something foreign to him in the chaos of battle. As he worked, he observed the Americans around him, not as propaganda had instructed, as weak or corrupt, but as disciplined, capable, and humane. Guards walked among the prisoners, enforcing rules, yes, but doing so without cruelty. The paradox unsettled Joseph. A nation that could have been ruthless instead chose restraint. A man who had trained for obedience, fear, and aggression now saw another path. Night brought quiet reflection. Lying on a clean bunk, Joseph stared at the wooden ceiling, remembering Tunisia, the battles, the fear, the friends lost forever. Letters from home arrived occasionally, censored and twisted with propaganda, trying to keep loyalty to the fatherland alive. Joseph read them with a new awareness, seeing how carefully words had been chosen to control minds, to maintain a version of reality that didn't match what he lived now. He began to question everything he had been taught, feeling a mixture of guilt, disbelief, and awe. Interactions with fellow prisoners deepened his perspective. Conversations ranged from shared memories of the war to the strange wonder of being treated with dignity as a captive. They laughed quietly over small ironies, the way guards reminded them of rules, the absurdity of their own expectations. Yet underneath, there was a deep, unspoken tension. Could this treatment be genuine? Could a country so strong, with the power to destroy them, truly act without malice? Joseph could feel his old beliefs cracking, like fragile walls giving way to sunlight.
As weeks passed, the camp became a strange kind of home. Yosef learned to anticipate the rhythm of daily life, the meals, the work, the brief moments of leisure. He noticed small details, the way sunlight fell across the orchard in the morning, the scent of fresh bread from nearby kitchens, the polite nods of guards passing by. Every moment reinforced a truth he had not been prepared to accept, that strength did not require cruelty, and power did not demand oppression. The more he saw, the more he realized that what he had believed about America, about freedom, democracy, and human decency, was incomplete, distorted by lies he had never questioned before. By the end of the first month, Joseph Weber felt a strange transformation taking root inside him. Relief, gratitude, and awe mingled with confusion and disbelief. He had come to Oregon in chains, prepared for fear, brutality, and suffering. Instead, he had discovered something he could scarcely name, a place where humanity mattered, where dignity could exist even in captivity, where a man could be an enemy yet treated with respect. This realization would haunt him, challenge him, and ultimately change the course of his life forever. In that quiet Oregon orchard, Joseph began to understand that he had not been sent to heaven, but perhaps to something even more extraordinary, a place where life, choice, and hope still existed.
Joseph Weber quickly realized that food was only the beginning of the surprises that awaited him in Oregon. Each morning, trays of roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and fruit arrived with a regularity that was almost comforting. He had spent months imagining starvation and suffering, yet here meals were not only plentiful but prepared with care. He noticed the small gestures, the way the cooks made sure each tray was complete, the way guards occasionally offered a nod of acknowledgement rather than a command. It was not the luxury he had been promised as a soldier, it was something stranger, something humane. The farmers in the Rogue Valley became a window into a world Joseph had been told did not exist. Many spoke German, and some had family ties to Europe. They treated him not as a captive, not as a defeated enemy, but as a worker, a participant in the daily life of their orchards. One morning, an older farmer offered him a slice of apple pie and in a quiet voice mentioned that when the war ended, Joseph could have work and a chance to stay in the country. Joseph almost laughed. Why would they offer such generosity to a prisoner? His mind wrestled with the contradiction. He had been trained to expect cruelty, punishment, contempt, and yet here was kindness, unexpected and unwavering. Work itself became a strange education. In the orchards, Joseph learned precision and care, patience and observation. Harvesting pears was not simply a chore, it required attention to detail, an understanding of timing, and a respect for the land. These tasks were repetitive, yes, but they taught him rhythm, diligence, and responsibility in a way he had never experienced in battle. The physical labor was challenging, but it was honest, and it was met with acknowledgement rather than scorn. The POWs began to understand that their value was measured not in obedience to fear, but in productivity, in contribution, in the respect earned through effort. Life outside the workday was equally surprising. Guards walked among the prisoners with authority, but without malice. There were no cruel punishments, no shouting matches. Occasionally, prisoners were allowed brief moments to wander the camp, write letters home, or engage in quiet conversation. Joseph was struck by the normalcy of it all. A country so powerful, he thought, could have destroyed them completely, yet it chose restraint. The realization unsettled him. In Tunisia, in the chaos of battle, strength had always been measured by fear, by domination. Here, it was measured by civility, by trust, by the capacity to withhold power even when one could assert it completely. Social interactions added another layer to this unexpected experience. Prisoners shared stories of their hometowns, their families, and their dreams in hushed voices under the shade of the trees.
Joseph listened, observed, and occasionally spoke, noticing the subtle changes in himself. The fear that had once gripped his chest loosened slightly with each passing day. He began to think not only about survival, but about understanding. He wondered about the Americans who treated him with such decency, about the choices they made, and about the nature of a country that could be so strong yet so merciful. Letters from home contrasted sharply with the reality around him. The propaganda continued to reach the camp, painting America as decadent and immoral, a society on the brink of collapse. Yet every day, Joseph saw the opposite. The country was orderly, productive, and surprisingly disciplined. The guards maintained rules, yes, but they were consistent and fair. The prisoners worked and rested without arbitrary cruelty. Even the architecture of the camp spoke of structure and care, not neglect or chaos. Every meal, every interaction, every moment of labor reinforced the growing contradiction between belief and reality. By the end of the second month, Joseph's perspective was shifting. The fear that had dominated his thoughts, the expectation of brutality, had not materialized. Instead, he found himself observing, learning, and quietly reflecting. The Americans were not weak, they were strong in a way he had not been taught to recognize. They did not need to dominate through terror. Their strength was quiet, deliberate, and moral. Joseph began to understand that this was a different kind of power, one that inspired respect, not obedience through fear. Small gestures left a lasting impression. The sharing of bread, the nods of acknowledgement from the guards, the patience of the farmers, even the chance to engage in meaningful labor, all of it left Joseph both amazed and unsettled. He began to question what it meant to be a citizen, to be human, and to be free. In the quiet orchards of Oregon, the German POWs were learning lessons that no battlefield had taught them. They were learning that decency could coexist with strength, that respect could be given even to an enemy, and that sometimes humanity was far more powerful than fear. By the time Joseph returned to his bunk each night, he carried a mixture of disbelief, gratitude, and confusion. Every day reinforced the notion that the America he had feared was a world apart from what he had been told. Every meal, every conversation, every simple act of decency chipped away at the walls of fear and indoctrination that had been built around him. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Joseph Weber began to understand that this place, so unexpected and surreal, was not only safe, it was transformative. It was teaching him something that would stay with him for the rest of his life, that strength and kindness were not opposites, and that even in captivity, a man could begin to learn what it truly meant to be free.
The days in the orchard settled into a rhythm that Joseph Weber could never have imagined back when he had feared capture. Morning light spilled over rows of pear trees, their branches heavy with fruit, and he would rise from a clean bunk to face the labor that, at first, felt like a punishment, but soon became a kind of education. Every movement, from plucking a pear without bruising it to stacking crates in neat rows, required attention, care, and patience. Joseph began to notice that productivity could be rewarding in itself, not because of orders or fear, but because of the quiet satisfaction of work done well. At first, the work was exhausting. His muscles ached, and his hands bore the calluses of unfamiliar labor. But in the toil, Joseph discovered an unexpected sense of control. In Tunisia, battle had been chaotic, brutal, and unpredictable. Here, in Oregon, effort had consequences, and those consequences were tangible and immediate. He saw the fruit of his labor literally growing before him. He noticed the trees thriving under careful attention, and in that small harmony with nature, he found something that had been absent in war: purpose. The Americans around him only deepened this sense of discovery. Guards treated the prisoners firmly but fairly, never cruelly, and sometimes with a surprising quiet patience. They reminded Joseph of the potential of discipline, exercised without brutality.
He began to observe not just the actions, but the attitudes behind them, the way an orchard foreman might correct a mistake without anger, or how a guard would enforce rules with calm authority. Joseph realized that strength could coexist with fairness. It was a lesson that went against everything he had been taught in the Hitler Youth and in the army, and yet he could not ignore its truth. Interactions with other prisoners became a mirror for reflection. They shared their past lives, stories of families, lost comrades, and moments of fear and shame from the battlefield. Sometimes laughter broke through in unexpected moments, a release of tension that had accumulated over years of indoctrination and war. Joseph began to recognize that he was changing alongside them. He noticed his own thoughts becoming less rigid, his judgments more nuanced, and his curiosity about America more profound. The orchard was more than labor. It was a classroom without walls, teaching lessons in patience, dignity, and human potential. One afternoon, as Joseph worked under the sun, he stumbled upon a project that would leave a mark for decades, a concrete garage he was assigned to help construct. He had never handled concrete before, yet under guidance, he learned the process: mixing, pouring, shaping, and smoothing. The physical labor was demanding, but it required precision and cooperation. Joseph realized that this work was more than a task. It was a symbol of transformation. Each brick, each slab represented a shift in his understanding of effort, consequence, and contribution. By the time the structure stood firm, he felt a sense of accomplishment that no battlefield victory had ever given him. Nightfall brought long hours of thought. Joseph would lie on his bunk, staring at the wooden ceiling, replaying the day. He thought about the contrast between the world he had left behind and the one he now inhabited. In Germany, obedience was demanded through fear, and kindness was often absent, regarded as weakness. In Oregon, he saw strength expressed through care, authority tempered with restraint, and productivity celebrated rather than punished. The realization unsettled him. He had been taught that his enemy was immoral and decadent, yet the Americans around him embodied discipline, order, and humanity in ways that surpassed the stories he had been told. Sometimes the German prisoners would pause and look around the orchards, the sun casting long shadows through the trees. They were free in a paradoxical sense, prisoners who could think, act, and engage without fear of random violence. Joseph noticed the subtle shifts in his companions. Hard edges of suspicion softened, and a quiet appreciation for the environment and the people around them took root. The orchard became a microcosm of a society he had never imagined, a place where choices mattered, labor was respected, and dignity was preserved. As the weeks turned into months, Joseph's reflections deepened. He began to question not just the morality of war, but the very nature of freedom and democracy. He saw that the Americans he lived among valued human life and labor, even for enemies. They understood that the way one treated others revealed character far more than the ability to dominate. The work he performed, the skills he acquired, and the patience he developed began to reshape his understanding of himself. He was no longer just a soldier or a captive. He was a man learning what it meant to be productive, responsible, and valued. Occasionally, Joseph would catch himself smiling at small victories: a crate stacked neatly, a row of trees harvested perfectly, the approval of a guard or farmer. Each moment was subtle, yet profound. He realized that the lessons he was learning were permanent, imprinted not in books or lectures, but in the rhythms of labor, the quiet gestures of kindness, and the moral consistency he witnessed every day. This transformation was not instantaneous, but cumulative, a slow unveiling of understanding that would shape his future choices. By the end of the chapter, Joseph Weber had begun to see Oregon not just as a place of captivity, but a place of revelation. He had learned that work could be meaningful, that discipline could coexist with kindness, and respect could be given even to those labeled as enemies. The concrete garage he helped build would endure for decades, but more importantly, the lessons it represented had taken root in his mind. Joseph Weber, a prisoner in chains, was slowly becoming a man free in understanding, witnessing the quiet power of a country that could destroy him, but chose instead to teach him what humanity really meant.
May 1945 arrived with a tension that hung over the camp like a heavy fog. Germany had surrendered, and the war that had defined Joseph Weber's life for years was suddenly over. Yet for the prisoners in Oregon, the end of the conflict brought little immediate relief. They had been trained to expect punishment for failure, for capture, for survival itself. Joseph had imagined officers pacing, shouting, perhaps even executing the captured as a warning to others. That had been the story he carried in his mind from Tunisia, a world of discipline enforced through fear and brutality. But when the American officers came through the camp to announce the surrender, there was no violence, no fury, no expectation of submission. The prisoners listened and then stood in silence. Joseph looked around at the men he had shared labor, meals, and long conversations with over the past months. They did not cheer, they did not cry, they did not collapse in relief. Instead, they stood quietly, absorbing a reality that their own propaganda had never prepared them for. Their enemy had chosen mercy. Joseph felt a strange mixture of awe and disbelief. They had been taught that Americans were decadent, weak, and merciless, that they would crush Germany without hesitation. And yet here was a country capable of immense power, exercising restraint. Their strength was not measured in death or domination, but in humanity. Every meal, every gesture of patience, every fair enforcement of rules had prepared the prisoners for this moment of truth. Joseph began to understand that decency, applied consistently, could command far more respect than fear ever could. The silence of the prisoners was profound. Many had anticipated grief, anger, even suicide at the thought of defeat. Yet months in Oregon had taught them otherwise. They had experienced a version of life under a system that rewarded contribution, not fear, and they had glimpsed the promise of choice. Joseph's mind wandered to the farmers who had offered kindness, to the guards who had enforced rules without cruelty, and to the concrete garage they had built, a monument, perhaps unintentionally, to the possibility of productive life even in captivity. In that moment, the prisoners grasped a lesson that their own leaders had never conveyed, that freedom was not only a political ideal, but a lived experience. Conversations among the men were hushed but revealing. They shared astonishment at the realization that the world they had been told was decadent and weak was instead disciplined, moral, and structured. Joseph reflected on the contrast between Germany, where obedience was demanded through fear, and the Oregon camp, where respect was earned and kindness extended even to enemies. He thought of the American officers who could have punished them, starved them, or humiliated them, yet chose fairness, patience, and preparation for the future. That choice, Joseph realized, carried far more power than any battlefield victory. As the days passed, Joseph watched his fellow prisoners in quiet reflection. Some walked the orchards alone, as if retracing the lessons they had absorbed from labor and observation. Others lingered at the camp's edges, staring at the horizon, trying to reconcile the Germany they had known with the reality they had experienced. The surrender had ended the war, but it had begun a different kind of struggle, understanding the moral and political world they had been denied for so long. Joseph, too, felt the weight of this transformation. He had arrived in Oregon expecting cruelty and fear, yet he now understood that human dignity could exist even in chains. Letters and news from home began to reach the prisoners, but they felt different now. The propaganda, once unquestioned, seemed hollow in comparison to their lived experience. Joseph read of destruction, of cities in ruins, of hardship endured by civilians. Yet he also saw in the American camp a model of what society could be: orderly, productive, fair, and humane. This contrast was both painful and enlightening. He realized that the world could be rebuilt not through vengeance, but through understanding, care, and the deliberate choice to treat others as human.
Even the guards seemed transformed by the moment, or perhaps Yosef simply noticed subtleties he had ignored before. Their authority, once intimidating, now appeared tempered with reflection. They were implementing the surrender not as conquerors, but as representatives of a system that valued structure, law, and moral consistency. Yosef understood that their restraint was not weakness, it was deliberate strength, a lesson in itself for men who had been trained to equate power with fear. By the end of this period, Yosef Weber and his fellow prisoners had internalized a profound truth. They had witnessed a society that could destroy them, yet chose preparation over punishment, dignity over cruelty, and civility over vengeance. Standing in silence after Germany's surrender, they had already begun to understand the paradox that had defined their months in Oregon. Freedom and decency could coexist with strength, and mercy could be more commanding than any weapon. Yosef felt a sense of quiet resolution. The war was over, but the lessons he had learned, the unexpected humanity, the structure, the choice, would stay with him for the rest of his life, shaping not only how he saw the world, but how he would live in it.
When the war finally ended and the German prisoners in Oregon were told they could return home, Yosef Weber faced a choice unlike any he had encountered before. For years, he had been trained to serve his country, to obey without question, and to believe that Germany was the center of the world. But the months he had spent in the Rogue Valley had opened his eyes to a different kind of life. A life defined not by fear, obedience, or propaganda, but by dignity, opportunity, and human decency. Returning to Germany now felt strange, uncertain, and in many ways frightening. Yosef watched his fellow prisoners prepare for repatriation. Some were eager to leave, driven by homesickness, loyalty, or duty. Others hesitated, sensing that the world they were returning to was not the same one they had left. Yosef felt a quiet clarity within himself. America had given him something rare, a chance to rebuild, to work with his hands, to live without constant fear, and to be treated as a human being rather than a tool of war. He realized that the country which had captured him in chains had, paradoxically, offered him freedom of a kind that Germany never had. He chose to stay. It was a decision that surprised many, including some of the American farmers and guards who had grown accustomed to seeing POWs leave when the war ended. Yosef remained in the Rogue Valley, taking up work in the orchards and gradually integrating into the community. The same farmer who had once offered him apple pie and a job now became a mentor and friend. Yosef learned to plant, prune, and care for the land with skill and precision, using the lessons he had acquired as a prisoner to guide his new life. Life in post-war Oregon was not without its challenges. Yosef had to navigate a culture that was at first foreign, and to reconcile his past with the present. Yet every day offered new lessons. He discovered the rhythms of American life, from market days in small towns to community gatherings, and he embraced the opportunities that came with stability and work. He also carried with him the memories of the camp, the humane treatment, the quiet strength of the Americans, and the friendships formed with other prisoners. Those memories became a foundation for the man he was building, teaching him patience, empathy, and resilience. The concrete garage Yosef had helped construct as a POW became a symbol of this transition. What had begun as a forced labor task became, over decades, a tangible reminder of his journey from captivity to purpose. Each time he walked past it, he remembered the discipline, cooperation, and care required to build something lasting. It was a monument not to war, but to transformation, a product of labor, patience, and the lessons learned from a society that valued human dignity. As years passed, Yosef continued to work in Oregon, eventually establishing a life entirely of his own making. He married, raised a family, and contributed to the community that had once been a stranger to him. Yet he never forgot the extraordinary circumstances that had brought him there. The kindness of Americans, the patience of guards, and the guidance of local farmers had shaped not only his survival, but his understanding of what life could be.
Joseph Weber, once a soldier captured as an enemy, had become a citizen by choice, a man who had learned that democracy, freedom, and decency were not abstract ideals but lived experiences. Visitors to the Rogue Valley sometimes noticed the small marks of history in his life. The garage still stood, weathered but solid, a testament to endurance and care. Joseph would smile quietly, knowing that the real legacy was not the concrete itself, but the lessons it represented, that human beings could rebuild, forgive, and grow even from the most unlikely circumstances. He had entered Oregon in chains, expecting fear and suffering. He remained there by choice, transformed by the experience of being treated with respect and humanity. Even in old age, Joseph reflected on the paradox of his journey. He had been sent as a prisoner, but he had discovered freedom. He had been trained to hate, but he had learned empathy. He had been told that strength required domination, yet he had seen that true power could be measured in mercy, fairness, and the ability to create life rather than destroy it. These lessons guided him not only in work, but in relationships, parenting, and community. They shaped the man who had arrived as an enemy and left as a neighbor, friend, and builder of something enduring. Joseph Weber's story is a reminder that history is not only made on battlefields or in grand gestures, but in small acts of humanity, in the choices we make when we have power over others, and in the courage to embrace transformation. The Rogue Valley, with its orchards, its quiet roads, and its enduring concrete garage, stands as proof that the lessons of compassion, dignity, and understanding can outlast even the most destructive conflicts. Joseph came in chains, but he stayed to build a life, one that honored both the past he had endured and the future he had chosen. By the time the sun set over the orchards, Joseph's journey had come full circle. From fear to understanding, from captivity to freedom, from enemy to citizen, he had discovered something profound, that life could be rebuilt, human dignity could endure, and a single act of kindness could change the course of a lifetime. The legacy he left was not only in the structures he built, but in the quiet lessons of humanity that would echo through generations in a place that had given him everything he never expected and everything he chose to embrace.